Hello and welcome to We Caribbean, a special program in which we discuss and analyze the issues affecting the region, giving a voice to those who are impacted. It's their issues, their concerns, their triumphs on We Caribbean. I'm your host, Doris Polo. On August 10th, citizens across Trinidad and Tobago took to the polls to vote for 41 members of the country's parliament. The elections came amidst a growing crisis caused by the novel coronavirus, which has infected more than 500 people and claimed over 10 lives locally. Now, on Saturday, Prime Minister Dr. Keith Rowley announced plans to reimpose strict measures to stem the spread of the respiratory disease. The nation's economy has undoubtedly taken a hit as a result of a drop in commodity prices, making the new government's job a tough one. So joining us to discuss Trinidad and Tobago's economic survival is development economist at the University of the West Indies, Dr. Marlene Atz. Dr. Atz, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me and good morning.
Now, my first question to you, citizens across the Twin Island Republic voted in a general election on August 10th. Now, usually the government is sworn in and the budget debate soon follows. And granted, this has been temporarily delayed as a result of an ongoing recount. What can we predict will be presented in the next budget, specifically as it relates to COVID-19?
Well, as you correctly said in your introduction, we have had, Trinidad and Tobago has had an interesting, albeit challenging past couple of months. 2020, while it marked the dawn of a new decade, also marked a significant, unforgettable period in Trinidad and Tobago's economic affairs. So we went into COVID-19, and in the midst of dealing with the COVID-19 onslaught, we were also grappling with the fallout from oil and gas in terms of how that impacted on the main source of revenue for Trinidad and Tobago, because Trinidad and Tobago is heavily dependent on the oil and gas sector. So we've been grappling with this double whammy. Now, going into the budget, and I had said this before, during the lead up to the elections, and certainly on Monday evening during some election coverage where I was presenting an economic perspective on the both leading parties, their manifestos, it is going to be an extremely challenging period for, well, now the PNM government, because they have gained the majority of the seats coming out of the election, although there is an issue that's preventing them from being sworn in. But going into the new fiscal year, this government is going to have to treat with some of the challenges that arose under the last couple months of their tenure. So what we're going to find is that, and you correctly said again, that on Saturday the Prime Minister announced some reintroduction of some lockdown measures, and I think the country was waiting, certainly the small, medium enterprise, the business sector was waiting with bated breath whether we were going to go into full lockdown as we did in March and April, because that had significant economic fallouts for the business community, for the country at large, but for the business community in particular. One of the things that would have happened when we locked down in March and April would have been high levels of unemployment, and the government would have found resources to provide support for those persons who became unemployed. So for the self-employed persons, the persons who might have been working in those sectors and those businesses that had to be closed for extended periods, so the food service areas, the restaurants, the bars, etc., etc. Going into the budget, the Prime Minister would have signaled before, he would have signaled that if the country had to experience another lockdown, the government would not be able to find all of the resources without, and I think there is a caveat there, without resorting to borrowing. Now, some borrowing would have been done in the previous months, March, April, May, etc., and some additional borrowing would have to be done if the country has to shut down. One, to provide support to some of the vulnerable people in our society, those persons who would have become unemployed, but in addition to those who would have become unemployed, those who ordinarily would have depended on social support, so your differently able, your old folks, etc., etc. So to keep the engine of Trinidad and Tobago's economic engine running, there will have to be some significant adjustments, and those will be reflected in the upcoming budget. Now, one of the things that I think this government, the PNM government that will continue, that is going to continue as a sitting government, they have shied away for years from a conversation around devaluation or depreciation of the currency. I think the time has come when that conversation will have to be put squarely on the table. If Trinidad and Tobago is to be more competitive, if Trinidad and Tobago is to diversify or transform our economy away from our over-dependence on the oil and gas sector, given what we now know in terms of a stark reality about our vulnerability from over-reliance on that sector, government is going to have to try to make other sectors, particularly things like manufacturing, a little more competitive so that they can export and earn foreign exchange, but also contribute to things like employment and economic growth in the economy. And part of that conversation, I think, will necessarily have to include a conversation around depreciation or devaluation of Trinidad and Tobago's currency.
Definitely, and it's interesting that you mentioned, the possible devaluation of the TT dollar, and you also noted that the country is heavily dependent on imports. So with that in mind, can we expect a price increase for goods and services as this pandemic rages on?
I think that once the currency is depreciated, yes, we're going to see some kind of domino effect in terms of the prices of goods and services because we're so heavily import dependent. We're going to see some increases. Things like our medicines, for example, are things that we import. So that is going to have an immediate knock-on effect. Some of the masks that we use, even for COVID-19, are imported. So there will be an immediate knock-on effect. And I think what the government, and I'm only hazarding a guess here, they have been hedging for the last couple of budgets that have been read. They've been hedging and shying away from that depreciation because they did not want the public fallout. Going into an election, governments generally are a little wary to make the population unhappy. But now that they have a fresh mandate from the people, they may want to take some hard decisions. But even in taking those decisions and recognizing what the social and economic impact could be on the population, the government may try to finesse how it introduces some of the measures that I think are absolutely necessary. I think a conversation around depreciation is important. I think a conversation around how we're going to close the budget deficit is important. I think because we've had a decline in our output as well, we are going to see some increases in unemployment. If we were to go to straight economic theory, once you have a decline in your output levels, and that has happened in Trinidad and Tobago, and our productivity would have declined as a result of COVID-19 and the closures, there will be some increase in unemployment. Some of the obvious things I've already mentioned, some of the sectors that have had to close because of lockdown measures, and those persons becoming unemployed. So it is going to be a combination of macroeconomic variables that the new Minister of Finance is going to have to treat with very carefully, because while you've been given a fresh mandate by the people, you also don't want to come out with too much austerity measures that will cause significant hardship where some of your population already is in a vulnerable situation.
What sort of cutbacks can we expect, given that the budget deficit is expected to triple?
I think one of the things the government, we've already rolled back the fuel subsidy. I think government may want to look at some additional subsidies. There are a number of subsidies to some state enterprises. So there's WASA, there's TNCheck, for example. But a conversation, and there's been a lot of talk about the size of the subsidies that are paid to agencies such as state enterprises, such as WASA and TNCheck. Now, just to put it simply, if government were to reduce their subsidies to, let's say, a WASA or TNCheck, it means that the cost of those utilities will increase because those enterprises will have to increase their costs to the average consumer so that they can essentially manage their affairs, because the subsidies are really support that they're getting from the government. And if those subsidies are reduced or adjusted downwards in any way, shape or form, it means that the companies themselves will have to raise their prices to essentially compensate for any shortfall in the subsidy now.
And I mean, we know that diversification, especially with the country being oil dependent, is very important. But would you say that the time has come for the government to invest more heavily in agriculture? Because now we know ahead of the budget, the lion's share of the funds usually goes to national security, health, and then education, but not so much agriculture.
Well, I mean, that has been an issue raised in the public domain for many years, that government is not paying sufficient attention, and that attention is being equated to the share of the national pie that is allocated to agriculture. Now, I have over the years adopted the position that I don't think we're supposed to be spending or giving a greater allocation simply for the sake of a greater allocation. We need to have a clear plan for the agriculture sector and what we want the agriculture sector. What is the value proposition from the agriculture sector? So there's several strands to that. One, we have a significantly high, a multi-billion dollar food import bill. So that speaks for itself in terms of whether or not we want to reduce that food import bill. Because I said we have to reduce expenditures. Government has to reduce expenditures. This is one possible way. So if you have an agriculture sector that at least provides some quantum of locally grown food, one, you deal with employment, so people become employed in the agriculture sector. Two, you reduce your food import bills, so therefore you reduce the government expenditure, and scarce foreign exchange, because when you import food, of course, there's a foreign exchange angle to it. So it seems to me that it makes good economic sense for you to invest greater or to pay greater attention to the agriculture sector, so that it allows for, as I said, that local content, that you make it a viable sector, because we need food to survive. My colleagues who are experts in the agriculture sector say that it is not a hard sell. You know, there have been several plans over the years, and I think if I were to go on the basis of what my colleagues would have shared with me, the problem is always implementation. And I think the implementation comes about because of what some of my colleagues refer to as the Dutch disease. Because we've always had this oil and gas sector, we focus a little on other sectors. Now, now that we're in this dilemma where we no longer have the luxury of depending on the oil and gas sector, because it is fairly clear that oil and gas prices are not going to rebound anytime soon, it makes sense for us to channel our attention and channel our resources into something that makes good economic sense for us as a country and for the people of Trinidad and Tobago.
Most definitely, and I know the Prime Minister was encouraging at one point people to start homegrown kitchen gardens, and he also showed some of his, which we just saw on screen. We will be taking a short break now, and join us in just a moment as we continue our discussion with Dr. Marlene Atts, economist from Trinidad and Tobago, on the country's economic future.
Follow our latest updates concerning the novel coronavirus by checking our special content in our website, where you will be able to get the most reliable details and numbers for each continent, available from your mobile device or desktop. Telesur, connecting the Global South.
Welcome back. We're continuing our discussion with economist Dr. Marlene Atts on Trinidad and Tobago's economy going forward. Dr. Atts, what are the secondary impacts of COVID-19 that the Keith Rowley administration should be concerned about?
Well, I like that question, because one of the things that the Prime Minister announced yesterday as well is that schools will be closed until for this entire first term, until December. So school as we know it, in terms of any conversation around face-to-face classes, will not happen perhaps until January 2021. Now, one of the secondary impacts, which will rear its head, and it's really going to become a crisis unless we address it frontally, will be the whole question of our education system and the impact on school children at all levels, from the early childhood level all the way through to tertiary level. When we closed in March, April, there was an immediate conversation around moving to online teaching, and there was a recognition at that time that not all things are equal in the education system, because I think the last estimate was that about 60,000 children did not have access to any kind of device to allow them to participate in online teaching. And then there were also questions around what constituted online teaching, whether teachers were actually going online and teaching, or whether they were emailing materials to students. I have friends whose children, the modality of engagement varies. So some would have had classes, if not 5 days a week, 3 days a week. Some would have had classes no days a week. Some would have had missed just sending information on a WhatsApp chat to the parent and expecting the children to do it. And there was no feedback loop, etc., etc. So there were questions around the modes of delivery and the number of children who have been without some form of teaching and learning since March or April of this year. Now, when you extrapolate that, so if we're going into until December, we can suggest that some children may not have had any exposure to teaching and learning for at least 9 months of the year, which is a frightening thought. So if you think, for example, of some children who come from homes where it's not the circumstances are not conducive to them learning at home, for whatever reason, whether it's a violent home, whether they don't have the resources, whether they don't have electricity, whether they don't have internet, whatever the circumstances are, that child going to school, that was an opportunity for the child to get out of the home and actually go into an environment where some measure of learning was taking place. If they come from a home where they might be poor, so going to school, they participated in the school feeding program, so they were assured of having meals, etc., etc. Now, in the initial stages of the lockdown, there was a conversation around having some of those school feeding meals delivered to vulnerable students throughout the country. I don't know how that worked. I don't know what was the outcome of that and how successful it was. But I'm saying that the secondary impacts, one of the major secondary impacts, is in terms of our human capital. What is going to happen to our children? Because not all parents either A, are able, in terms of their education levels themselves, to homeschool the children. B, some parents might actually be looking to go out to work to eke a living. So they could be straddling keeping their job and earning some income and having to deal with this child at home. So you have children being left at home. And I'm saying that it's a very complex situation that we need to be mindful of. And in moving forward, now that the election dust, well, it hasn't quite settled, but now that the government has been given a new 5-year mandate, these are some of the things that I want us to also look at as a country. How do we, A, identify who these vulnerable children might be, but also B, ensure that no child gets left behind. I mean, it is going to be a crisis in education if we allow, even if it is 60,000 children. When we locked down, UNESCO did an interesting global map looking at how many children were affected by the education, the abrupt closure of the education systems across the world. For Trinidad and Tobago, it was about 200 and something thousand people across the early childhood straight up to tertiary level. Now, I don't know what they mean by affected, but 200,000 minds have been impacted one way or the other.
Yeah, most definitely. I know mental health issues are going to be a very grave concern. We've also seen a rise in domestic violence incidents. Women's rights groups have been speaking out about that. Now, my next question, what are your predictions for the third quarter of 2020? Because we've been seeing a decline over the years.
Well, I think we can expect an increase in unemployment in terms of Trinidad and Tobago. I think we can expect a decline in economic growth. The unemployment would probably increase. Some predictions are that we probably go up closer to 7-8%, up from 4%. We're going to see some economic, probably about a 10% decline in our output, which is going to significantly affect it. Negative economic growth, of course, I don't think that's any surprise, because nothing has been happening in our economy, so to speak. There is going to be, of course, the budget deficit that we spoke about, and those are some of the key indicators. As I said, there would probably also have to be some adjustment to the exchange rate. I don't know if the government is going to touch that now, but I would suggest that they have a quick look at it so that we can make all of the adjustments to any impacts and any fallouts from a depreciated exchange rate. We'll have sufficient time to adjust moving forward, but it is something that I think needs to be addressed if we want to treat with the foreign exchange expenditure that continues to happen, but also if we want to create a more competitive manufacturing sector and also treat with the high level of imports of goods and services that is putting an additional strain on our exchange rate.
With this in mind, will Trinidad and Tobago be forced to, at some point in the not too distant future, head to the IMF?
That is inevitable. And while I've heard pronouncements about going to the IMF, I think it makes sense to have a fresh pair of eyes come in and provide you with some guidance in terms of how you can manage and navigate your space. So it may not be, I think about Jamaica's program, Jamaica's adjustment program that they have successfully managed to navigate under the IMF. And I think there is an opportunity for us in trying to reshape and to recalibrate our economic system. I think it will not be unhelpful for us to engage support from the IMF, because I think they have a better understanding of our economy. They have that independent sort of oversight, which I think would be useful in terms of helping us shape our narrative and which kinds of economic measures that we can put in place to help us weather this particular storm.
Yeah, and now amid the pandemic, earlier you mentioned that the country did a lot of borrowing. I mean, US 600 million was taken from the Heritage and Stabilization Fund, and then the finance minister floated a 500 million into nation, all in a bid to fund social programs to assist the vulnerable, which includes small and medium-sized businesses. And we also saw 1.3 billion in cash tax refunds, 1 billion in VAT bonds and salary relief grants, totaling $2.36 billion. I mean, the country obviously cannot, continue on like this. So what sort of measures do you think needs to be implemented to generate income for these vulnerable groups?
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned the small and medium enterprises. I think there is also an opportunity for us to create a more vibrant SME sector, one that is robust and one that contributes to exports and foreign exchange earnings. I think now is the time for us to also focus on that. In terms of the social protection programs, some of them, I mean, we already have a large suite, I forget whether it's 60, but we have a lot of social protection programs on the books of Trinidad and Tobago. Being able to enhance those in the way in which it was done in the immediate COVID period, I don't think that is going to be sustainable. But the programs already are there. So you have the unemployment relief programs, you have the disability grants, you have the pensions, etc., etc. So those will probably have to remain on the books as they are, because it will provide support to some of these vulnerable groups. But certainly some of those grants, the rental income grants and those other things that you mentioned that were implemented post-COVID, I don't know that the government has the wherewithal, the financial wherewithal, or the fiscal space to allow them to implement some of those moving forward. So what we will have to do is to find ways to create employment. People can talk about things like the CPEP program. I understand the role and function of a CPEP program, but I've also articulated for years that I think there is time for the time has come for us to reinvent the CPEP program from it simply being something where you become a CPEPer for life. So you go into the CPEP program and you don't graduate out of it. I think CPEP provides an opportunity for employment for those persons in our society who may not have, significant levels of education, but I think while you are in the CPEP program, it should motivate you. It should be so structured that after a certain period of time, you graduate out of the program. Because when you finish work I think they finish work at 10 or 11 in the morning, you should be required to do something else to improve your own path, as it were. So when you finish, whether you go and you do some kind of hairdressing course, some kind of cooking course, you learn some trade, or you go and you do some academic subjects, so that in a year's time you can graduate out of CPEP and you can go into a different kind of employment, so that someone else has the opportunity to come into CPEP and to start off small as you did, but to also graduate out of the program. But I think we need to reimagine how we treat with programs like the CPEP program. We need to reimagine. I think we need to reimagine how we treat with programs like the CPEP program. We need to reimagine how we engage persons who become unemployed, what kind of reskilling may be required, what kind of reskilling may be available. We have community centers throughout the country, throughout Trinidad and Tobago. How can we put these to use so that we can make people, we can provide opportunities for people to reskill themselves, even as COVID-19 and the oil and gas fortunes have resulted in them becoming unemployed for one reason or the other. But I think we have to be creative in this particular space in this time, because, as I keep saying, no government can do it alone. So it really is going to require the population to become a little more imaginative and patient in some regards in terms of how we navigate the space moving forward.
Most definitely. Thank you so much, Dr. Atz, for your time and your expertise on this very critical issue.
You're most welcome. It was my pleasure being here.
Thank you so very much. The world's economy has significantly contracted amid the global pandemic. A tourism and oil-dependent nation, Trinidad and Tobago will be forced now more than ever to diversify and sustain the nation in this very dark hour. For We Caribbean, I'm Doris Polo. To keep up with news and more, go to our website, tellusenglish.net, or join us on social media. See you next week.